Some of the smartest people you know are going quiet, not because they don't have answers, but because they've realized no one's listening. Meanwhile, the loudest voices keep rising, fueled by outrage, ego, and ignorance. But why does this keep happening? Carl Jung had an answer, and it's more disturbing than you think. Jung noticed a pattern long before social media gave everyone a megaphone. He saw that people who truly understand themselves and the world often pull away from it. Not because they don't care, but because they see exactly how much of it is built on noise. Meanwhile, those who know the least tend to speak the most, and with the most certainty. The result? A society where volume gets mistaken for value. It's tempting to believe that truth will eventually win, that people will come around. But Jung warned that the truth is often drowned out by archetypes, deep, unconscious patterns that society follows without realizing. The wise elder, the tyrant, the fool. These aren't just story tropes. They're psychological patterns, and they play out in governments, in workplaces, in comment sections. And the fool, Jung noted, is particularly dangerous, not because he's evil, but because he's unaware. He acts with confidence, shouts with conviction, and convinces the crowd not through reason, but through repetition. The strong, the ones with depth, reflection, and restraint, see this happening, and they hesitate. Not out of fear, but out of a sense of futility. Why speak if no one is listening? Plato noticed something similar over 2,000 years ago. In the Republic, he described the philosopher as someone who would rather stay in the shadows than enter politics. Not because they couldn't lead, but because they saw how irrational the crowd could be. In his metaphor of the cave, the prisoner who escapes and sees the light doesn't run back to enlighten everyone else. He knows they won't believe him. They'll mock him, or worse. This is why the strong stay silent, because they've seen the cave. They've seen what happens to people who try to drag others out of it. Now, think about modern media. Think about the incentives. Outrage gets clicks, simplicity gets rewarded, and nuance, that's punished. Social platforms are built to amplify anger, not insight. It's not a conspiracy. It's just what the algorithm learned we respond to. And so, the loudest voices rise. Not because they're right, but because they're aggressive, persistent, and emotionally charged. Jung would say these voices are driven by the persona, the mask we wear to gain approval. The persona isn't about truth. It's about survival. People perform outrage because it works, because it signals belonging, because it shields them from rejection. And slowly, without even noticing, society becomes a stage where everyone is acting, and no one is thinking. But underneath that noise, something else happens. The people who do think begin to withdraw, not because they're cowards, but because they understand the cost of engaging. They see the futility in arguing with someone who isn't interested in truth. They see that most debates aren't about understanding, they're about dominance. And they choose silence, not as surrender, but as preservation. Nietzsche called this the resentment of the herd. The mass doesn't want truth, it wants comfort. And the moment someone speaks a truth that threatens the group's illusions, the herd turns on them. That's why so many intelligent people become isolated. Not because they can't communicate, but because they've learned that speaking up often backfires. So they turn inward, they study, they reflect, and they wait. You'll see this in history too. The most influential ideas often come from people who were ignored or silenced during their lives. Socrates was executed. Galileo was condemned. Spinoza was exiled. Jung himself faced criticism for pushing beyond Freud's framework. But over time, their ideas endured. Not because they shouted louder, but because they were rooted in truth. And truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to survive long enough to be rediscovered. The danger, though, is what fills the silence. When the strong step back, the void doesn't remain empty. It gets filled with noise, with performance, with people who don't understand the consequences of their words, but speak them anyway. And that's how systems rot from the inside. Machiavelli warned of this too. In The Prince, he argued that perception matters more than reality in politics, that people will follow whoever appears strong, even if that strength is just theater, and that those who are actually wise must learn to play the game or risk being crushed by it. But not everyone wants to play. Jung's archetype of the introverted thinker doesn't chase power. They seek understanding. And understanding doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to isolation. Now here's where it gets darker. When society rewards outrage over insight, the incentives shift. It becomes safer to conform than to think, easier to echo than to reflect. And over time, silence becomes the defense mechanism of the wise. Not out of fear, but because wisdom doesn't scream. It waits, it endures. Jung believed that the path to individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, requires going inward, not following the crowd, not playing the game, and certainly not shouting to be heard. That kind of growth is quiet. It's uncomfortable, and it often sets people apart from the world around them. The more someone understands themselves, the less they need to perform. But performance is what modern systems demand. That's why the disconnect keeps growing. The most thoughtful minds rarely go viral. The loudest ones do. And while the strong wrestle with complexity, the weak weaponize simplicity. One shouts a slogan, the other spends years unpacking an idea. Guess which one gets rewarded? This is why the strong stay silent. Because the conversation isn't about truth, it's about theater. Because speaking up often feels like talking to a wall that's yelling back. And because once you've seen how shallow the game is, it's hard to pretend it matters. But this silence isn't harmless. When thoughtful people opt out, they don't just protect themselves. They leave the public square undefended. And those who rush in to fill the space rarely know what they're doing. That's how misinformation spreads. How bad ideas take root. How history repeats itself. The famous historian and philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. Not because evil is rare, but because it's often carried out by ordinary people doing what they're told, following the loudest voices, obeying without thinking. That obedience doesn't require malevolence, just passivity. And passivity's easy when the thinkers are gone. So what's the answer? Jung wouldn't say be louder. He'd say, integrate your shadow. Face your fear of rejection. Speak not to dominate, but to reveal. Not everyone will hear you. Many won't understand. But silence isn't always noble. It can become complicity. Plato believed that the people most qualified to rule were also the ones least willing to seek power, because they valued truth over control. But he eventually saw that if the wise don't lead, the fools will, and they have. The ones who shout the loudest often have the least to say, and the ones who could change everything remain silent, watching, waiting, hoping someone else will step forward. But if everyone strong stays silent, the world doesn't pause. It just gets louder. So the uncomfortable truth is this: silence protects the wise, but it also empowers the ignorant. And eventually, someone has to decide whether truth is worth the noise. Because wisdom isn't meant to hide. It's meant to outlast. And sometimes, to do that, it has to speak.